Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Yesterday I mentioned that I plan to begin reading through Imam al-Nawawi's Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran, the etiquette of the bearers of the Quran, or shortened down to etiquette with the Quran. And inshallah, I'll begin doing that today. And the idea is that I'll be doing this in bite-sized chunks, in small amounts that anyone could listen to on the go. And if you could excuse me for a moment, one of my cats is begging to be let out. So I'll be back in a moment. I apologize for that. I gave him plenty of time to go out, but what to do? Okay, so inshallah, right now we'll begin with Imam al-Nawawi's introduction to his book. Instead of going into his biography, I want to get right into the book. And inshallah, at a later day, we can go back and we can cover who Imam al-Nawawi was. So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. The Sheikh, the legist and knowledgeable Imam, the scrupulous ascetic, the precise and skillful Abu Zakaria Yahya Muhyiddin ibn Sharaf ibn Hazm al-Hazimi al-Nawawi, may Allah Most High have mercy upon him, said, Praise be to Allah, the noble benefactor, possessor of infinite power, superiority and perfection, who guided us to belief and who has made our religion superior to all the rest. He graced us by sending us the most noble unto him, the most superior of his creation, his beloved and intimate friend, his servant and messenger, Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, through whom he effaced idol worship. He honored him with a miraculous Quran, which endures the passing of time. With it, he challenges humankind and jinn in their entirety. Something to note here is that he says in their entirety. He doesn't talk about it just being a challenge to a part of humankind or a part of jinn. It's a challenge to everyone. And by the way, this is a bit of a hint that the Sharia addresses everyone, not just Muslims. And with it, he silences the misguiders and transgressors. He made it a comfort for the hearts of the insightful and perceptive. It does not wear out with frequent repetition and the changing of time. He made it easy to remember so that even young children may memorize it. And may Allah make us among those who have done that and do it, and may our children be among them too. He guaranteed its protection from being compromised by alterations and accidents, and it is indeed protected by the praise of Allah and His exaltedness for so long as night and day endure. So as long as time goes on, the Quran is protected from any sort of alteration, whether malicious or unintended. He made it well suited for the cultivation of His sciences for the ones whom He chooses to have skill and mastery, and He gathered therein from every discipline that which opens the hearts of those who have certainty. I praise for Him for this and for His other innumerable graces, especially for the grace of belief. And here it's worth noting that this is one of those graces that we tend to take for granted, and we don't acknowledge how great it is. And so take the next moment to ponder how much of a blessing it is that you're a Muslim. And for those who are converts, ponder the blessing of being guided to Islam. And for people who were raised as Muslims, especially in these troubling times, ponder the blessing of remaining Muslim in spite of all the trials and tribulations that go in your life. So ponder this for a moment while I let the cat back in. So alhamdulillah that we're Muslims, and alhamdulillah for belief, and alhamdulillah for the guidance that we have been given. Back to Imam al-Nawawi, he says, I ask him for the generous bestowal of his good favor for myself and my loved ones and all other Muslims. Ameen. I testify that there is no deity other than Allah, one without partner, a testimony which attains forgiveness, saves from the fire anyone who testifies it, and brings one to reside in paradise. And again, this shows the amazing and tremendous ni'mah of belief, simply by stating the testification of faith, the shahada, and having belief in it. One removes themselves from the possibility of eternal damnation in the fire, in the afterlife, and puts themselves in paradise for eternity. Now, if they do sins that are unforgiven, perhaps they'll have to work it off in the afterlife, but simply by having iman and testifying to it, one changes their fate in the akhirah. He continues, I testify that Muhammad is his servant and messenger, the caller to belief. Allah bless him and give him peace and his folk and companions, and honor, ennoble, and extol them until the end of time. So this is his opening supplication, and if you have the book and go back, what you'll notice is that he mentions many of the amazing things of the Quran, and it's a preamble that gives us an idea of what the Quran should be doing in our lives, and he's going to come back to almost every single point that he made there. So let's continue. He says to commence, and Arabs in their writings, they would also say amma ba'd, and this was an indicator that someone is making a transition from one style to another. So he's going to make a transition from a style of making dua and supplication, and he's going to transition to the style of teaching, or from the topic of dua to the topic at hand here. And he says, Allah Sublime and Most High has graced this nation, this ummah, and may Allah increase it and its people in honor with the religion that He has chosen, the religion of Islam. And although he doesn't make an explicit reference to the Quran here, anyone who reads the Quran is going to notice that this is an allusion, a reference to Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3, where he says, Al-yawmu akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakum al-Islam dinan. This day I have perfected for you your religion and completed my favor on you and chosen for you your Islam as a religion. Astaghfirullah. Okay, so what's the important thing in there? The verse mentions that Islam is a ni'mah. Okay, so we're tying back what Imam al-Nawawi says to where he would have gotten it. Because someone might ask, well, where did we get this idea that the chosen religion is Islam? Well, there we go. It's straight out of the Quran. He continues, Allah has graced them by sending Muhammad, the best of his creation. May the most eminent of blessings, bounties, and peace be conferred upon him. And he honored them with his book, the best of all speech. Allah Sublime and Most High gathered in it all that is needed. It includes stories of the first people and the last, spiritual counsel, similitudes, etiquette, and rulings of all types. So notice that he mentions that the Quran isn't just a book of law, it isn't just a book of aqidah, it isn't just a book of stories. It isn't a book with a single topic. Rather, it's a book that contains various types of knowledge, all of which suit the purpose of hidayah, of guidance. And he mentioned that earlier on in his supplication. Okay, so let's keep going. Allah Sublime and Most High gathered in the Quran all that is needed. It includes stories of the first people. Notice he says all that is needed, but all that is needed for what? If you have the misconception that the Quran is a book of science, then it doesn't seem to have everything that's needed. But if you have in your mind that the Quran is here for guidance, then yeah, it has everything that's needed. Okay, so when we judge something, we need to know what it's for. The purpose of the Quran is guidance. So it has everything that is needed for that purpose. It's also a book that has some law, and it has everything that we need to be able to understand the laws that Allah wants for us. But we'll continue. We'll get to this stuff later on. And the Quran includes clear, sure proofs indicating His absolute unity and other things that His messengers, may Allah grant them all peace, brought. Irrefutable arguments against the followers of ignoble heresies. He multiplied the rewards for reciting it, ordered us to heed it and give it veneration, to adhere to it through proper conduct, and to spend generously in honoring it. And this last point is very important, and he's going to reiterate it in a moment. But in the Quran, we are ordered to approach Allah's word in a particular manner. So when we talk about the ahkam or the rules about working with the Quran, this isn't to bring something between the reader and Allah. No, this is to bring the person closer to Allah, because Allah has told us what He wants us to do when we read the Quran. If you do what He wants us to do, then you're getting closer to Allah simply by doing it. But if you do the opposite of He wants, even out of ignorance, you're not going to get closer to Him. Okay, you're not going to get closer by disobeying Him. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to approach His Quran and Him in a particular way, then this is something we need to be doing. This isn't the law getting between you and Allah. This is Allah telling you how to get closer to Him. Okay, so what did Imam al-Nawawi said? He multiplied the reward for reciting it, and later on he's going to mention how someone who recites the Quran with ease has one reward. Someone who recites it with difficulty gets at least 2 rewards. He ordered us to heed it and to give it veneration. And he's going to bring this too. And to adhere to it through proper conduct. Remember, the Quran is a book of guidance. When you receive a letter from your boss, do you look at the envelope and how beautiful the letters are and look at the postcode where it was sent? No way, man. You open that letter and you see what He wants you to do. Okay? So the Quran isn't intended to be looked at. It's intended to be read, acted upon, understood. Okay? And he also mentioned, and to spend generously in honoring it. And if we look through times, people spent time honoring it, memorizing it. They spent time honoring it by writing it out in the most beautiful calligraphy possible. They spent money in contests where they would gift money to the people that honored the Quran the best way, either by reciting it or by writing. So we'll see that people throughout time have done this. All right. One of the things we miss today is just how rare the Quran is. There's only one Quran. There's only one in existence. We've got multiple printed copies of it everywhere. And this sort of makes us devalue it. But go back 100 years before massive commercial printing presses, where a village would be lucky to have a few written copies of the Quran. Now, cities with their libraries would have a bunch. But in the past, a village might have one or a family might have one. And it was rare and it was precious. Today, if you look at your bookshelves, you probably have multiple copies from different printing presses, from different parts of the world. And when something is easy to get, we don't value it as much. Okay, so we're a wealthy nation today, and we should be spending lavishly to honor the Quran and the people who bear it. Okay, so groups of the exemplary and outstanding scholars have written about the excellence of reciting the Quran, books known to people of reason and discernment. But the resolve to memorize or even peruse these books has waned, so no one benefits from them except for some exceptionally intelligent individuals. Okay, so if we look again at history, we're going to find that early books were really, really long, because early authors were trying to gather everything that was written on a topic. Everything. And they would include chains of transmission because they were writing for people who would be able to go through that chain of transmission and analyze it and discern its truthfulness, its authenticity, its veracity, its sihha. So in the beginning, scholars were recording knowledge for other scholars to go through. And it was just too much. Unless you're a hadith master with knowledge of all of the people mentioned as transmitters of the various reports, it's just, I mean, it's information you can't make use of. So you might read 100 words for the chain of transmission, and then you read a hadith with just like 5 words in it. So the long books weren't very efficient for people who didn't have mastery of the sciences that were expected to be known by the original intended audience. Wow, that was a long sentence. Okay, so what happened? The book started really long because they had everything that people could gather. And they would gather good and bad things, and then sometimes they didn't necessarily explicitly mention whether they were authentic, inauthentic, or even fabricated, because they wrote for an audience that would be able to determine this on their own. Later generations, they didn't have this knowledge. You couldn't expect that every scholar was a master of sciences, of biographies, of transmitters. And so those books for the original scholars weren't that useful to the later ones. It would be a huge struggle to actually tap into those books and make use of them. So what did later scholars do? They started shortening or removing the chains of transmission, and they would put their judgment on the text that was transmitted. And they might remove the ones that are inadmissible, or they might stick to just the ones that are strongest, or they might stick to the ones that are most direct. So later scholars would often abridge, summarize, and compress earlier books. And Imam al-Nawawi is one of the scholars that engaged in this. Okay, so he says, groups of the exemplary and outstanding scholars have written about the excellence of reciting the Quran. This is an acknowledgement that he is standing on the shoulders of giants. So as big as Imam al-Nawawi is, he's leveraging the scholarship of prior scholars, many of whom, if not most of whom, he considered to be his superior. Books known to people of reason and discernment, but the resolve to memorize or to even just read these books has decreased to such an extent that no one benefits from them except for some exceptionally intelligent individuals. Okay? So Imam al-Nawawi is going to save us by concentrating on what we actually need to know, by getting rid of the shell and giving us instead the kernel that's inside. Okay? So he's hinted at this, and he's going to be a little bit more explicit now when he says, I have seen the people of our land, Damascus, may Allah protect and preserve it, and all other lands of Islam. Ameen. Concentrating on reciting the mighty Quran, studying it, instructing it, reading it, and learning it in groups and individually. They spend enormous effort in this day and night, and may Allah increase their desire for it and for all kinds of obedience, desiring thereby the pleasure of Allah, the possessor of majesty and honor. So why they engage in this? They engaged in it because they were seeking Allah's pleasure in the dunya, right? No, for the akhirah. Okay, so they were reading the Quran, teaching it, studying it, understanding it so they could put it into practice for the sake of Allah. So this called me, these people engaging in the Quran with so much effort, called me to put together a concise treatise concerning the proper etiquette to be observed by the bearers of the Quran and the characteristics of its memorizers and students. So notice in the first earlier paragraph, Imam al-Nawawi said, books have been written about the proper way to engage the Quran, the etiquette with the Quran, but these books are really, really big. And so people don't read them anymore. But I notice in my time that people are going all out in their efforts to work with the Quran, to study it, to read it, and teach it. Okay, I see them doing this. Now, something you're going to ask is whether whether their efforts are being spent the best way. Yes, working with the Quran is the best way, but how you approach something is going to determine how quickly you get stuff out of it and how much you get out of it. So if you approach the Quran the way it's supposed to be, what you expect is that you're going to reap its benefits much more than someone who approaches it somewhat haphazardly. So if you want, imagine if you just threw a bunch of seeds on the top of the ground. You going to get much out of it? You might get something if the birds don't eat it first. But if you plant it underneath the ground in the soil properly, if you cultivate it, then you're going to get a massive yield. So the point Imam al-Nawawi is making here is that if we approach the Quran correctly, the way that we're supposed to, we're going to get a lot more out of it. And out of nasiha, out of wanting to give the best possible advice to his generation and subsequent generations, he went through and he wrote a book that's going to explain to them how to do that. And inshallah, we're going to be some of the benefactors. So let's keep going. He said, "This called me to put together a concise treatise concerning the proper etiquette to be observed by the bearers of the Quran and the characteristics of its memorizers and students. This is because Allah Most High has prescribed showing goodwill towards His book, which includes illuminating the proper conduct of its bearers and students, instructing them therein, and calling their attention to it. I favor brevity and I'm wary of prolixity." Okay, so I'm going to favor being short in my expression, and I'm going to avoid being long-winded. I limit each chapter to one subject of etiquette, and for each subject, I point to a number of its categories. Most of what I mention proceeds by omitting chains of transmission, even though I have the chains of transmission readily present and have the authorization to transmit them. But my goal is to call attention to its sources. Okay, so he knows that if he brought the chains of transmission, people are either going to get stuck in those or they're going to skip it altogether. And since the real point here is to get at the transmitted text, he's going to make it as short as possible. So he says, but my goal is to call attention to its sources, and what I mentioned alludes to what I omitted. So he's not going to bring everything that he has. Not only is he going to remove most of the chains of transmission and give us just the companion who transmitted it and one of the reference books where we're going to find it, not only is he going to reduce the amount of information he gives us in that perspective, he's also going to mention just one or two examples that will back up what he says. So he's not going to give us a shotgun blast of everything he has. So even though he's got it and he can pull it out, he's not going to do it because it would be too much for us. And remember what his goal is? His goal is to give us a book so that we can benefit from the Quran. And he's writing a book for the common Muslim, not for the scholar. The reason for preferring brevity is my desire that it be memorized and that it be fully useful and disseminated. And when he says memorized here, it could mean rote memorization, word for word after word, which would be tremendous. Okay, that would be awesome for someone to go and memorize this book. But what's more important than memorizing the book is understanding it and putting it into practice. So another way that we can memorize something is to understand it and act upon it. That's another form of memorization. And we'll get to the point I was going to make later on. We got to wrap this up because I said I only wanted to do small chunks. So the reason for preferring brevity is my desire that it be memorized and that it be fully useful and disseminated. I singled out unfamiliar vocabulary and diction that occur in the chapters and provided a clear summarized explanation on voweling which I have placed at the end of the book in the order of their occurrence in the chapters. The purpose of this is to complete the book's benefit to its possessor and to remove doubt from its seeker. Included within the chapters themselves are groups of principles and invaluable lessons. So Imam al-Nawawi, when he wrote the book, he singled out words that might be difficult for the average reader, okay, difficult to pronounce, or the meaning might not be known to people of his time. So what he did is he grabbed those words and he made an appendix at the end of his book where he explains how to pronounce the word and what the word means. And he also threw in some additional stuff at the end. When I translated this book, I kept this appendix. Originally, people advised me that I should just remove it because it's not of any use except for the Arabic reader. Because if we explain how to pronounce an Arabic word to people that don't know Arabic, then it doesn't really help them much, right? Unless they're learning Arabic. But wait a sec. Maybe we as English-speaking readers get a different benefit from it. Or we get part of the benefit. Okay, and what's the benefit I'm trying to get to? It shows the intense care that our scholars had for preserving this religion for coming generations. Okay, instead of referring us to another book, and there were other lexicons out there, and he authored one of them. Instead of doing that, he included it at the end of a book that he intended for the masses. Okay, so he wanted to give them a single book that they would need to get benefit from this topic. He didn't refer them to other places. All right, so I kept this appendix at the end of my book because I wanted English readers not only to have access to that information, but to also get to experience this aha moment of how much care our scholars had for preserving the religion. And remember when I mentioned how older books would have everything in them? Right? Preservation of knowledge, both good and bad knowledge, okay, good and bad information, is something that our scholars cared about. Why would we want to preserve bad knowledge? Well, if we preserve bad knowledge and we mark it as bad, then someone else can't come in later on and try to fool us with us. To fool us with it, astaghfirullah. Okay? So included within the chapters themselves are groups of principles and invaluable lessons. Now remember, he's going to be including reports, hadiths in the book. And he says, I clarify the strongly and weakly authenticated hadiths and ascribe each to whichever Imam related it. In some circumstances, I have overlooked hadiths, though this is rare. Okay, so he says, I clarify the strongly and weakly authenticated hadiths. Now, some people are going to have difficulty with this idea of weakly authenticated hadiths, right? So he's going to explain something. He's going to say, know that the scholars of hadith and others like who? The fuqaha, permit working with weakly authenticated hadiths concerning the merits of actions, fada'il al-amal. In spite of this, I restrict myself to those that are rigorously authenticated and do not mention the weakly authenticated ones except in a few circumstances. Okay? So he is going to try to use authentic hadiths whenever possible. Now, most of the time, he's going to mention the weighting of a hadith. Is it sahih? Is it hasan? Hasan sahih? Okay? Those are all admissible for legal rulings. And he's going to try to go to the strongest that he can, right? And he's going to try to avoid using any weak hadiths. Now, what we can get from what he just said here is anything we find in this book is potentially actionable. Now, there might be other evidence that would modify and explain the final legal ruling we get out of the hadith, but as far as is the hadith worthy of consideration and legal analysis, the answer is yes. So anything he mentions in here, he's already vouched for it, that it's something that we can act upon. So he mentioned the thing about using weaker hadiths. Now, in the Tibyan, in the book we're reading, he doesn't say that much. In other books, he says a little bit more. So, for example, in Al-Adhkar, he mentions that the fuqaha, the muhaddithin, and others consider it permissible and recommended to use weak hadiths for meritorious acts and for encouraging and discouraging. As for legal issues, only authenticated sahih and fair Hasan hadiths are used, though it is permissible to use da'if hadiths that indicate something is offensive, though this is recommended and not obligatory. So when it comes to what hadiths can be used, it's a little bit more sophisticated than is it sahih? And if it's not sahih, we throw it out. And in fact, if we look at usul al-fiqh, what they'll often do is they'll classify hadiths into maqbul and mardud, accepted and rejected. And when they get into that, accepted isn't just sahih. It's a wider variety of hadith than just that. Okay? Point has been made, we'll keep going. And he's now gotten to the end of his introduction, and he's going to make a supplication. And inshallah, this will be the end of today's little bite-sized sitting. I've probably gone longer than I expected. And this will be the end of our lesson today, inshallah. He says, "My trust and reliance is upon Allah, most noble, and to Him is my unbridled resignation, and upon Him is my utter dependence. I ask Him that I travel the path of guidance for protection from the people of heresy and insolence, and that I constantly be upon this and other good things with continual increase. I humbly beseech Allah most sublime that He grant me good deeds that I may gain His pleasure, that He make me among those who fear Him and properly observe His rights, that He guide me to perfect intentions, that He facilitate for me all types of good, that He assist me in all excellent qualities, that He keep me steadfast in this until death, and that He does all of this for all of my loved ones and all other Muslims, male and female. He is our sufficiency and the best reliance, and there is no power and strength except by Allah, the High, Most Great. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen."